on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Simon Moya Smith. He writes for The Nation and The Cut. He lectures at the University of Colorado at Denver. He tweeted this. Before white people came to this land, there were no jails, no homelessness, no laws against homosexuality or abortion. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples emphasized health, housing, freedom to love who you love, and the fact we need Mother Earth. She doesn't need us. Well, that's a tidy summary of 2,000 years of Western civilization. Where does somebody learn these things and then go on to print them at The Nation and offer them up to young skulls full of mush at the University of Colorado? Oh, he's a Columbia journalism alum. Yeah, private versus public at the university level, and increasingly private versus public at the K through 12 level. That is not enough to distinguish those institutions that are mainly interested in turning out leftist political activists who will continue their work of denigrating America and the West. That's a starting point. But as our friend Eric Kaufmann argues in a recent piece, school choice is not enough. Eric Kaufmann is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Professor Kaufmann, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Great to be here, Dan.
So you're always doing interesting survey research, and you've done another one, this survey of young people aged 18 to 20 about the sort of coursework they're being exposed to as they matriculate through K through 12 and into college.
Yeah, and so this was really in response to claims that critical race theory isn't being taught, radical gender theory isn't being taught in schools. And of course, it's very difficult to find out exactly what is being taught. But the best way that we could think of, Zach Goldberg and I at the Manhattan Institute, is to survey people who were either just in school age 18 or just leaving age 19 and 20 and ask what they were taught. And what that showed really was that 93% had heard from an adult in school about a radical race or gender concept. So it's almost saturation level now in American schools. I should add it's in almost 90% of 90% of schools in districts that are heavily Republican. So this is happening right under the nose of Republican politicians and parents.
Right. And Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, well, Professor Kaufmann, I teach at Howard. I'm playing the role of Ta-Nehisi Coates in this role-playing game. I teach at Howard, and I expose my students to ideas I disagree with all the time. As a black man in America, how could I not talk about writers or assign authors with whom I disagree? So, of course, this is part of the give and take. This is part of the broadening of horizons and so forth. One book like mine or like Ibram Kendi's does not an indoctrination camp make.
Right. So the first point, I guess, to state is that in 7 out of 10 cases where these young people heard these concepts, those concepts were taught as fact, so they were taught either no other viewpoint was provided or it was claimed that there was no other respectable viewpoint. So basically, in 7 out of 10 cases, these really quite radical pseudoscientific and not evidence-based ideas are being taught as truth. Yeah, that's kind of indoctrination. And I think it's especially serious in the school system where kids are captive It's not like you opt in into an elective as in university. So, I think this is really pretty well wholesale ideological indoctrination, especially when you consider that these theories in many cases aren't that far removed from essentially racial conspiracies. Essentially, a conspiracy of white people against black people is not very far removed from the way these theories operate. So, I think this is pretty serious. And of course, as we show and we'll probably get into later, this indoctrination is really working. It really does change attitudes.
Well, what recommendations do you have for parents to fight back?
Well, I think it's really tough, and I think one thing you see in the report is, school choice alone is really not going to do it. I mean, it may be that if you're a very switched-on parent and you have good information about a school and everything it teaches, maybe you can choose a school that teaches a classical curriculum if that's available to you within a reasonable distance. But in terms of the impact on American society as a whole and politics, I don't think that's going to move the needle very much. So yes, an individual parent may be able, if they're highly informed and motivated, to get their kids away from this. But I think if we want to talk about American society as a whole and dealing with the indoctrination level in society, then we're going to have to start talking about things that Governor DeSantis is talking about in Florida, which means bans on CRT and gender ideology and class, much more emphasis on political impartiality in teaching.
Right. I mean, I know, of course, that the proponents of critical theory studies, they have no interest in partisan outcomes or affiliations of students. They're not trying to do anything. But as your survey research points out, I'm sure they'll be stunned to learn that they're having an impact in terms of the partisan distribution of young people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I think Republican politicians really need to wake up to the impact this is having. We've now got evidence on millennials and Gen Z that they're really not. The pattern in the past has been people as they get older, they gradually switch to the Republicans. That doesn't seem to be happening amongst the younger cohorts now. One reason I think could be the effective impact of this indoctrination. And so if we look at, just to give an example, a young person whose mother is a Republican, who is taught no critical race or gender concepts in school, on average, 61% of those children, 18 to 20-year-olds, are Republican and 18% are Democrat. That's with a Republican mother and no critical race or gender heard in school. Then if you go to the same child, Republican mother, but heard the maximum of 6 possible critical social justice concepts, that goes from 61% Republican to 30% Republican amongst those kids. So both Republican mothers, the impact of that exposure drops the share from 61 to 30%, so cuts it in half and increases the Democrat share to 29%, about even. So the impact of this on partisan affiliation is absolutely massive. The impact also on belief, support for affirmative action, support for white guilt, and increases, doubles. And so, again, a massive policy issue impact. So the only way really to deal with this is going to be to tackle indoctrination that's occurring in schools. Now, it's also occurring in private schools. It's occurring in homeschooling, by the way. 88% are exposed. So school choice is really not going to have much impact. It's worth pursuing. So I definitely think it's worth pursuing, but really to change the game, we have to take the school reform agenda much more seriously, the way Youngkin in Virginia and DeSantis in Florida are doing.
How do you distinguish between being exposed to critical theory and being imposed upon with critical theory? Because there is a distinction. I'm fine with people reading Kendi or Robin DiAngelo or Ta-Nehisi Coates or whoever. And so, but obviously that needs to be, among the choices and discussion, not this is truth received from on high and now this is what you should believe in order to be a good person. So how do you distinguish the environment where it's presented in the latter way that I just suggested as opposed to the former?
Yeah, I mean, if they were teaching, Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter and,
Right.
and Coleman Hughes and all of that alongside one for one with the critical race theory, then that would be fine. And that would turn up, by the way, in the survey data. People would say, oh, yeah, well, we heard competing respectable views. Yeah, I'm all for that, even though I think that the arguments of Kendi and others are not analytically or empirically sound in any way. I still think, fine, open debate, but the problem is we can't really trust currently, at least in K-12, that open debate. Now, at the university level, I'm less concerned because university has less of an impact on attitudes. People can opt in and out of courses more easily. And so I think there I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't be in favor of CRT bans, but I think in schools, until and unless we're able to get some kind of inspection and measurement regime for impartiality, I think it's probably best to go with the CRT ban.
Right. And just to go back to some of this additional survey data here, you report that those exposed to no critical social justice theories, critical theory, break 27-20 Republican. Those who have been taught the maximum of 8 critical theory courses, 53-7 Dem. So I mean, you're just moving. Your people that come to the table, they're sort of they're neutral. They haven't had exposure, but you're just giving them exposure to one thing from one angle. And as I said before, essentially saying, in order to be considered a good person, an ally, you need to believe these things, and you're just moving a generation over to this side of identitarian politics.
Well, that's right, yeah, and that has a whole series of implications as this becomes the next cohort of voters and eventually the median voter. If you're allowing the public education or the education system, even in private schools, so I mean, this gets at teacher training programs, but what that means is, I take an attitude like racial preferences. Favoring racial preferences increases from 17 to 44% of young people as we move from those not exposed to these critical social justice concepts to those exposed to the maximum of 5 concepts. So that's more than a doubling in support for things such as racial preferences or the belief in white guilt, for example, the belief that the United States is a patriarchal society, that it's built on stolen land and is a racist country. These sorts of things expand greatly. So what that represents is you've got a threat to both the Enlightenment values and also a threat to American social cohesion and national identity. So yeah, I think this is I would call it a cultural emergency, and it really has to come up the list of priorities for Republicans.
He is Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future, and you can check out his piece that we were just pouring over, School Choice is Not Enough, The Impact of Critical Social Justice Ideology in American Education. Check that out at the Manhattan Institute. Professor Kaufmann, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank, a bank where relationships still matter. I'm Dan Proft, and I know this because Signature Bank